This past Sunday, Iranian President Ebrahim Raisi and Foreign Minister of Iran Amir Abdullahian were killed in a helicopter crash near the Azerbaijan border. State media attributed the crash to foggy weather and an unspecified technical failure. Raisi's death comes amid deepening internal dissent in the Islamic Republic and mounting tensions between Iran and other key regional actors. On April 15, Iranian forces launched a missile and drone attack on Israel, raising fears of regional conflict. So what lies ahead? What does Raisi's death mean for the future leadership of Iran, for its people, and for regional security? Now, today, we'll examine all of that and more. I'm David Satterfield, director of Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy in Houston, Texas, and this is Baker Briefing. Joining me today to discuss what the future may bring are Mohammad, Ayatollahi Tabaar, and Kristian Ulrichsen, both Middle East fellows at the Edward P. Jerejian Center for the Middle East. Mohammad's research focuses on U.S.-Iran relations, nuclear politics, and the politics of ideology. Kristian's work examines the changing position of Persian Gulf states in the global order, as well as the emergence of longer-term, non-military challenges to regional security. And I'm going to start with Mohammad. Mohammad, first tell us a bit about how the fundamental system actually works in Iran. What's the role of the president? What is or who are the key decision-making persons, structures in Iran today?
Thank you, Ambassador. So the system, the Islamic Republic, is based on dual sovereignty from God and sovereignty from the people. And that was enshrined in the 1979 Constitution as a result of power struggle between various political factions, including the Islamists and the nationalists at the time. So basically, there is a supreme leader on top of the system who should be a supreme source of emulation, a religious scholar of Islamic jurisprudence, a grand Ayatollah, basically. That was Ayatollah Khomeini in 1979. And at the same time, there is sovereignty coming from the people, and that is a president who is directly elected by popular votes. The supreme leader himself is selected by a body called the Assembly of Experts, and these are 88 senior clerics. They themselves are elected by popular votes as well. But of course, there is a guardian council that often vets who's running for what office, and most of them are often disqualified for not being loyal to the system. So the supreme leader is the one who designs the major macro level policies of the state, and the president has to implement these policies. But because the president is directly elected by popular votes, it has some additional level of legitimacy and a popular mandate. And that has always created some clash between the president and the supreme leader in the past. The president wants to see more flexibility on various economic and foreign policy issues, whereas the supreme leader seems to be more ideologically driven, aspiring to prevent the revolutionary ideals of the system.
Mohammad, was Raisi a challenger to the hardline views, or very much a part of an increasingly exclusive hardline orientation of the critical institutions in Iran?
Exactly. He was the second. In a way, he was an anomaly in the system. When you look at the history of the Islamic Republic, often presidents and the supreme leaders came into a clash. And Raisi seemed to be a different president. He came to power to be a loyal ally of the supreme leader, in fact, subservient to the supreme leader, to the office of supreme leader, to the Revolutionary Guards, and not challenge that. And he brought the entire state apparatus to help deliver the policies that the supreme leader designed. He's coming from the conservative core of the system. He was a low-level judge, a prosecutor in the 80s, eventually became Attorney General and the head of the judiciary. He was also involved in the executions of various political prisoners, political groups in Iran in the 80s. And he was brought to power by revolutionary forces to basically usher a new era of the Islamic Republic in which the system would be highly cohesive and controlled by the conservative camp.
And what happens now?
So there are a lot of analysts who are arguing that Raisi's death could open the Pandora's box of Iran's factional politics, and political struggles among different actors will start again. I honestly think it will be the opposite. I think given the tragic death of Raisi, and the government announced 5 days of national mourning, there will be funerals. So my sense is that in this context, in this climate, all political contenders will be careful not to seriously challenge each other, not to seriously challenge the system. So my sense is that there will be a smooth transition. The vice president, according to the Iranian constitution, took over. He's now the acting president, and there will be a presidential election within the next 50 days. My sense is that there will be probably another close associate of Raisi, maybe one of the current cabinet members, or someone who could resemble Raisi, not necessarily in terms of religious credentials. It could be a layperson, but someone who is an ultra-conservative, loyal functionary of the system might come to power and become the next president and basically follow Raisi's path.
Mohammad, last question before we turn to Kristian for Gulf reaction and the impact on U.S. relations with Iran. What about the succession to the supreme leader's position?
I think, as I said, the transition to the next president will be smooth, but that's exactly the issue. I think the transition for the next supreme leader might become a little bit more challenging in the long term. So Raisi was viewed as one of the top, or perhaps the top contender to be the next supreme leader. He was being groomed to go through the experience of being president, exactly what Khamenei himself did in the 80s before becoming the supreme leader. Of course, there is another potential contender, and that is Ayatollah Khamenei's own son, Mojtaba Khamenei, that many believe that he is another contender. My sense is that Mojtaba Khamenei is more of a shadowy figure close to the intelligence and security apparatus, and he is running the show from behind the scene. He's the one helped Raisi to come to power. So my sense is that he will do the same thing. He will be the kingmaker in the next round, and they will find another figure. I think one potential candidate could be the current head of the judiciary. There are other figures. So the system is flexible enough to find loyal individuals whose religious credentials may not be a perfect fit for this position initially, but they will adjust the position to the individual. But again, because they had been investing a lot on Raisi, so it may take a while before they can prepare another person to succeed Ayatollah Khamenei after his death.
Kristian, all of this has significant implications for the Gulf states, as it does for the U.S. And while the attention of the Middle East, much of the world, has been focused on Gaza, Iran, not Gaza, remains the strategic challenge, a challenge that's been addressed in recent years by a combination of accommodation, de-risking, self-help, and the desire to strike relationships that counter Iran, relationships with the United States, as well as with Israel, whether for its own sake or as an instrumentalization of the sought-after relationship with the U.S. How have the Gulf states responded to this event? Do they, broadly speaking, agree with Mohammad's assessment that it will be more of the same in terms of the hardline policies pursued?
The initial reaction from the Gulf was that on Sunday, when the helicopter was missing, there were expressions of concern. And then on Monday, expressions of sympathy and support. And we saw a series of telephone calls from Gulf leaders to the acting foreign minister, Ali Bagheri Khani, expressing those condolences. We've seen a continuation of the high-level dialogue that we hadn't seen in the Gulf between Saudi and Iran and between the UAE and Iran prior to 2021-22. I think the perspective from the Gulf states is that there will be continuity in Iranian politics post this event. The fact that Bagheri Khani, the deputy foreign minister, is now the acting foreign minister, is, I think, a sign for the Gulf states of that continuity. Bagheri Khani, like Abdullahian, the foreign minister, was well known as a regular visitor to the Gulf for negotiations, either as part of the attempts to re-engage with the JCPOA, and then after those attempts largely fell away, Baghdadi Khani was also a regular visitor in just other ways to try and continue to maintain dialogue to prevent regional conflicts from escalating. And I think certainly from a Gulf point of view, they see a continuity. This doesn't affect the broader process by which Gulf states are de-risking. They have maintained and established that dialogue with Iran, which has now come through the last 8 months in Gaza, a really serious test. We've seen a continuation of that dialogue to try to prevent the conflict from becoming a regional one that could put at risk all of the economic plans in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And so from a Gulf point of view, I think they would see that the system in Iran can absorb this unexpected shock, and by presenting their own expressions of support and condolence, can make it clear that they are not acting with any ill intent, at least at this point in time.
Mohammad, if the Supreme Leader were to pass as well during this 50-day transitional period, your expectation would be continuity would obtain rather than some significant controversy over succession or shift in policies followed?
I expect more continuity. If anything, they're going to double down on continuity, especially when it comes to foreign policy. Raisi is seen now as a success story, someone who within 3 years brought Iran back from being on the verge of an economic collapse, as they argue, because of the U.S. sanctions, to finding ways to circumvent U.S. sanctions. And Iran's oil production before Raisi came to power was around 400,000 barrels per day. Now it's back up to 1.7 million barrels per day, most of which goes to China. It's partly because of geopolitical issues, because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, because President Biden has relaxed enforcing these sanctions. But I think it's also because Raisi brought the entire state apparatus to coordinate with the IRGC to find ways to circumvent sanctions.
And Mohammad, that's an extraordinary comment you just made. Raisi is regarded as being a success. By whom? The people of Iran, those who are politically active, those who have demonstrated or perhaps support the demonstrators, or the internal command structures of the regime?
Exactly. These are two completely different forces. By the regime, he's going to be portrayed and remembered as a loyal and successful case that helped Iran become a rising power, becoming a player in the region and beyond, now even helping Russia in its war against Ukraine. At the same time, though, domestically, of course, he's being criticized strongly across the board by various, not just opposition, just ordinary Iranians, as someone whose economic policies have failed. The inflation rate is staggering. Many see the country on the verge of political and economic bankruptcy and implosion. Of course, the whole brutal crackdown of the regime against women, against others during the protests, another element. So there is a gap between the official narrative and the popular narrative. The official narrative, as I said, he's going to be probably one of the most successful presidents. But on a popular level, it's a completely different story. I mean, on his watch, Iran saw one of the most radical and anti-regime demonstrations in the history of the Islamic Republic. And I think these two visions are going to continue clashing against each other, no matter who comes to power after Raisi.
That said, Kristian, do you expect continuity in the positions taken by the Gulf, broadly speaking, towards both Iran, but also towards the United States?
I do expect continuity, especially both towards Iran and to the US. I think in the short term, the Gulf will be looking to see how this political transition in Iran plays out. As Mohammad said, this will be the first presidential election since the Mahsa Amini mass protests of 2022. We saw the recent parliamentary elections in Iran have a record low turnout, which indicates a degree of popular apathy, which only needs a spark to escalate into regime-threatening protest. So I think from the Gulf point of view, they'll be looking at the next 2 months to see what happens next. I think with the US, especially the Gulf states, will be hoping and seeking to make sure that they continue to ensure that there's no regionalization of conflict. And I think that's the most important thing. I think what we saw in April, during those series of strikes between Israel and Iran, we saw Gulf leaders trying to work back channels on all sides to ensure that there was no escalation. And I think that will continue to be their priority no matter what happens.
Mohammad, the question everyone asks before the helicopter crash, certainly now after. What is, as you project forward, beyond the replacement of the president, perhaps even beyond the next succession to the supreme leader's position? How challenged, fundamentally, are the structures of the regime that have kept it, keep it today in place? Where do you see that trend line going? Static, increasing challenges, diminished challenges? What's your prediction?
It seems to me that the internal challenges are rising as its legitimacy is declining quickly, even among the traditional conservative base. At the same time, it sees itself externally as a rising power. The challenges it is facing regionally and globally are going down. So it is actually leveraging what it sees as its foreign policy successes to bring about domestic legitimacy. So it's increasingly adopting a national security or a nationalist discourse of a so-called strong Iran, that the Islamic Republic managed to turn the country into a major player and sell it to the population and tell basically even increasingly secular population that even if they don't buy the ideology of the regime, for the prestige and for the security that is bringing to them, the population should recognize the achievements. I don't know to what extent it has worked so far, but this is the approach that the regime has.
Mohammad, last word. Iran has adopted an extraordinarily careful bridging approach to the sequence of events after Gaza. It has acted in a way that underscores its pretensions to leadership, to be the leader of the axis of resistance, so-called, but it's done so in a way which has not invited the type of devastating Israeli or Israeli-U.S. response that could have happened had either Hezbollah or Iran taken actions which certainly Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas's military wing, anticipated would happen. Same holds, at least as far as we can ascertain, with respect to a nuclear weapons program. Do you expect that careful straddling to maintain as the policy of the leadership?
So the leadership seems to becoming increasingly risk-prone. So the Islamic Republic traditionally was very risk-averse. And I think one of the consequences of Raisi's presidency was creating this homogeneous, cohesive system that allowed the leadership to start becoming more and more assertive regionally. We have been hearing from various IRGC commanders saying that since Raisi came to power, they felt more comfortable in conducting ballistic missile tests or expanding their military capacities. So the system is increasingly risk-prone. And I think one of the reasons that the regime decided to launch the massive drone and ballistic missile attacks against Israel was partly to signal that its calculations have changed and give more assurances to those proxies in the region who were doubting Iran's resolve to deal with Israel. So I have seen various comments coming out of Iran that one of the reasons that they decided to launch this attack was to counter some of the accusations that were coming out of their regional allies. The same thing on the nuclear issue. I think we may see the system becoming increasingly assertive in expanding its nuclear program. Right now, it's a nuclear threshold state. And if they see a window of opportunity or a window of threat, they may decide to take the final steps. And the fact that various senior officials have started threatening that at some point the Islamic Republic might change its nuclear doctrine shows that the internal calculations have changed. This was a topic that until recently was a taboo. No one was allowed to talk about Iran's nuclear program and the possibility of weaponizing it. And now they talk about weaponizing and acquiring nuclear weapons.
Mohammad, on that point, which merits further discussion, as well as the utilization of Hezbollah, the Houthis, as proxy or more than proxy challengers and power projection elements for Iran, for the state. We'll have that discussion further in the future. Thank you, Kristian. Thank you. We will be discussing how the Gulf continues to de-risk in the face of what is happening now and what may be happening in the future as we watch Gaza, as we watch the Red Sea and events in Iran. Thank you both. Baker Briefing is brought to you by the Baker Institute for Public Policy, which provides meaningful, nonpartisan policy analysis on the most critical challenges facing Texas, the U.S., and the world. Thank you.